So the paper started out as a reaction to a book by Eric Posner and Adrian Vermeule, which is called Executive Unbound, and it's about, and I think the subtitle is something like After Madisonianism. So it deals with American institutions, and it's an argument in favor of the plebiscitary president. So the idea is that it would be better if both Congress and legal institutions got out of the way and let the president solve problems, right? And so our paper is a kind of reaction to that. The wonderful thing about writing about a book that Eric Posner and Adrian Vermeule wrote is that they don't shy away from very clear and sometimes extreme-sounding statements. So they don't shrink from being criticized. So while it may sound sometimes that I'm exaggerating what they say, I'm not exaggerating. I'm saying what they say. So the book, the empirical parts of the book have to do with two periods of emergency. One is the period after 9/11. And the other, a shorter section, is a period after the financial collapse in 2008. And both of them have the same story, which is, in effect, the story that people like Richard Cheney and John Yoo and others in the American political pantheon have argued in favor of the president taking responsibility for resolving these issues, and that attempts to impede the presidential action, either coming from courts or from Congress, that is, are counterproductive. And in fact, Eric and Adrian think they actually can't work at all. So it's not so much that they're counterproductive, it's that they don't work at all. That is, the president simply can't be bound by such restrictions. All right, so now there's another line of literature that they briefly allude to, which is in the longer tradition of American political science, which has to do not with emergencies, but with the normal evolution of presidential versus congressional power. And basically the bottom line is more power is going to the president, and it's been going that way for 200 years, or maybe 150 years anyway, since the Civil War. So that on that line, which is associated with Terry Moe and his students like William Howe, effectively there's two versions of it. It's inevitable, that is, that's why it's going that way, and it's a good thing, right? Which is essentially, in the non-emergency area, essentially what Eric and Adrian also adopt. So what, my collaborator, Roderick Hills, and I are arguing for essentially the position of not so fast. So this is a paper about applied theory, since this is an argument that's going on at a theoretical level in especially law and government. In other words, it's a problem that won't wait for you guys. It's going to, this is already happening, and it will continue to happen. And unless people, pay attention to it more analytically, it's just going to go. So that's what I am going to talk about. So here's what the outline will be like. First of all, I've briefly summarized Eric's and Adrian's position. I'm going to talk about Madisonianism. That is, first I'm going to talk about three models of republics, which are actually all introduced by Eric and Adrian's book in some ways, or by Eric's work, incidentally. One is Weimar, which was a presidential system. Presidential, in a sense, was an independently elected president. And one is Republican Rome, in which there was executive power, that is, the consuls who were elected independently of anything else, and so they held power separately. And the third is the Madisonian system. And they discuss each of these. I'm going to come back to those in a minute, but I'll first talk about the Madisonian system. So the Madisonian system is a system in which there are three powers, essentially: executive power held by the president, a legislative power held by the branches of Congress, and judicial powers. And Madison, of course, writes very specifically about the mechanisms by which these powers are checked. And so what we do in the paper is we try to provide a background theory for why it is those checks are what they are. So it amounts to separating the concept of balance from the concept of check. So the concept of balance we have is one which you can find in the Federalist, but you can also find it in Cicero and other Republican writers. Balance is, what are the actual features of successful governing structure? So we argue that it combines three things. One is energy. That's what Hamilton wrote about in the Federalist Papers having to do with the executive. That is, there has to be some decisive element of the government that can take actions. Another is deliberation. So you have to, it's before shooting at a target, you should probably know what the target is. So it's thinking about what to do. And that's what Madison and others thought was largely going on in the legislative. It's what Cicero and other people writing about Rome thought was going on in the Senate. And the third is assent, which is to say that there has to be some sense in which what's going on in the government is related to what people will find acceptable or will assent to. That is, where they won't actually rebel or what they'll, in some sense, identify with. So those three elements are what we think have to be preserved in a governing structure. And they're done in different ways in different forms of government. In the American structure, of course, it's done in a presidential model. And so we see the checks, which are built into the structure, as ways of maintaining balance. Now, the checks, in case, for those of you who don't think about American government, are run like this. Madison and every Republican at that time up to that time, thought that the most dangerous branch was the branch of government, of any government like this, would be the branch closest to the people, the legislature, right? So there's lots of checks against the legislature. So, for example, you divide the legislature power in two, the representatives, the House of Representatives and the Senate in the United States. In the Roman system, you actually have the Senate, and then you have the direct election, the popular assemblies, which elect the consuls. So you divide the powers that way. In the American system, another check is you give the president a share of the legislative power, so he gets a veto or a partial veto. So these are basically ways to sort of stop the most dangerous branch from usurping the power of the other branches. And there are checks against the other branches. They're weaker. All right, that's the big thing about them. So, so that's the basic structure of the American system. You have this, we think, this aim of balance that has balanced different features of government to work well, and then you have checks aimed at preserving the balance. Now, that's the system outlined in the Federalist Papers in Federalist 51. It's arguably the best description at that time of what was expected to happen under the Constitution. And I think the fair claim, which both Eric and Adrian and we agree with, is that it hasn't worked very well. And the way it hasn't worked very well is the following. The checks against Congress, this is us, not them. The checks against Congress worked really well, partially because Congress is a collectivity. It's in its nature not very decisive, because they have to form agreements to get majorities, especially agreements to get majorities of sufficient size to overwhelm a presidential veto. So the checking of Congress has made it the case that Congress is more or less incapable of doing the thing that Madison thought it was capable of doing, that is usurping executive or judicial powers. It was incapable of it to begin with. And by putting checks in it, it just made it worse. Whereas the checks against the president and the judiciary are much weaker, and that both the presidency and the judiciary are much more decisive institutions. Both are hierarchical institutions. So, both the president can basically take decisions, and if he doesn't want to, he can ignore information that comes up from below. The judicial system's a hierarchy, that is, you have a Supreme Court done by strict majority rule with no checks on that, and hierarchical control of judges below. So both those systems are relatively decisive compared to Congress. Both those systems are fully able to encroach on the other branches. And that is what we think has happened. So we have an argument in the paper, which we call a one-way ratchet, which comes to the following claim, which I can talk about if you want, which is if Congress delegates authority to the judiciary, which it does by enacting a law and entitling judges to enforce the law, the power doesn't come back to Congress. It stays with the judiciary. And if Congress delegates authority to the executive to run an agency or whatever, the power doesn't come back. The reason it doesn't come back is that once either the judiciary or the agency has the power, if there's a shift in the political winds, they can adjust the way that power is implemented so they can maintain the power by adjusting their policy outcomes. And you have to work out the individual models to figure out how that happens, but basically it means that when delegations happen from Congress to either of the other branches, they're one way, right? So that's part of our account about why it is the case that there's a steady stream of usurpation from Congress, which it gives away powers at different times for good political reasons, according to it, and they stay over with the other branches. And so historically, what's happened in our account is that both the presidency and the judiciary have become more powerful over time. And anyway, so that's our diagnosis of the issue, which means that on our account, balance has been disturbed and the Madisonian checks don't work at all. So Adrian and Eric's idea is to get rid of the whole apparatus, based on an idea that they don't work, and so therefore we jettison the whole thing. Our idea is we might be better to figure out a way to take the Madisonian, the view we attribute to Madison, whereby the whole point is to maintain the appropriate balance between energy, deliberation, and assent, and figure out a way to redesign institutions to actually achieve it in modern conditions. So that's the thrust of the paper. So,
do you want comments?
Anytime.
As we're going? Yeah.
Sure.
So with respect to the legislature sort of ceding power by establishing agencies, and they still have legislative oversight, and they still have to pass a budget for these guys, right?
Yeah.
So if they're all locked up in their majority problems and things like that, then maybe it's easier to hold the budget back.
Yeah, that's okay. So we don't claim, unlike Eric and Adrian, that congressional checking can never work. We think congressional checking is badly motivated in the sense that there tends to be checking by individual congressmen or small groups of congressmen. And that typically is the way it works in the budget. I mean, that is to say, Congress as a whole could agree to hold a budget hostage. But more commonly what happens is a committee or a committee chair, basically uses its power of the budget over a certain agency to get the agency to do what it wants in order to get its budget. So you get distortion incentives because the interests of Congress as an institution don't track the interests of individual congressmen. So you get checking, but it's sort of not. It doesn't achieve the collective end that we attribute to Madison, which is this end of balance. So it's not that we say. So of course there are things like control of the budget and oversight things, and we think they're they're ineffective and distortionary to some extent, which is where we agree with Eric and Adrian. They are. But we don't think they're nothing. We just think they're ineffective to some extent and distortionary where they are effective. So we agree the budget's there. So anyway, there's a couple questions I have for you all. Okay, one is, can we figure out a better way to align the interests of Congress in such a way as to preserve its prerogatives where that's appropriate, right? So the ways we've thought about, so one thing that happens nowadays is that currently, last 15 or 20 years, the American system has become, the political structure has been polarized, right? So you have a sharper distinction between Democratic and Republican positions than has historically been the case. So, people writing in this area who've noticed that have decided that checks and balances don't work very well when Congress and the President are held by the same party. So, for example, looking at the post 9/11 circumstance, you see after 9/11, the Bush administration had a unified, Congress was controlled by the Republicans as well. They had very adventurous legal policies that they advanced either through executive order or through getting legislation through a friendly Congress. That is the Patriot Act and other things entitling, allowing them to do different ways of interrogation, of detention, it's all these different policies. So some people think that the best thing to do is when government is unified, to structure institutions so that when government is unified, the opposition party can have additional oversight authority. So for example, in the United States, all the committees in Congress are controlled by the majority party. But you could have, in principle, oppositional committees controlled by some oversight committees controlled by the opposite party with subpoena power. So for example, that would be one solution that would lean against the unified government incentive. We don't actually think that's the huge problem, but that is that's one kind of a solution that you could find, which is to redesign either congressional or other institutions to lean against, let's say presidential adventurism in the emergency case. All right, so that's one example. Another question we have is that the positive side of their claim is that elections are enough. That is to say, we can actually achieve sufficient control or accountability or responsiveness by a president merely through election processes without any other checks, which is something that there's been lots of writing about election. My reading of that writing is that elections are extremely coarse modes of ensuring accountability, partially because votes are so lumpy and few, and that the time intervals are long between elections, and when they do, insofar as they do work, they distort it as well. So you have the elections, the electoral cycles and other phenomena. So we're pretty skeptical that elections are sufficient, so we're inclined to think we need something else. So that's what, this paper is mostly an attempt to outline the problem, to give this theory of balance, which is a way to articulate why it is we have checks at all built into the structure, and to evaluate, and also to evaluate the capacity of elections by themselves to control the motivations or incentives of presidents. Tom? Yeah.
So John, when I look quickly through your paper, I never got a sense of what you guys think is an example of a well-working Madisonian system. Of what is it that, the Madisonian system, when it works well, what is it that was making it work well, and what are the outputs?
It never works well.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So why are we trying to recreate something that looks sort of like that structure, which always thought was at best a weakly functioning system? And more particularly, how do we know from outputs whether the system is working well or not?
Okay, so
as opposed to from process. I mean, everything we talk about is we observe the process somehow is breaking down. But what is it about outputs that we're observing that we would like to look different?
So let me do the first part. So the two, I didn't want to go into the examples of Rome or Weimar, where there were, at least it's a claim that for periods, Republican Rome worked well, right? Now, let me just do that.
Not on Weimar, right?
No, Weimar for periods worked well.
Yeah, but for very short periods. Right?
Yeah, for short periods, yeah. Well, just, it's a matter of scale. Just blow it out like that. It's all relative, Tom, in that respect, right? Yeah, about 4 or 5 years, yeah. Well, let's take Republican Rome, which at least at some level worked well for about 300 years. So there, the structure was one in which, it's kind of an oligarchy, but it had electoral components. That is to say, the executives were elected directly. That is, everybody was entitled to vote. Their votes were counted unevenly, but still they were all entitled to vote. There was a Senate, which basically consisted of people who had been high-level executives, and they were sort of, an advisory committee to the consuls, effectively. And so it was the case that, and incidentally, in Rome, everybody had a veto. So the tribunes could veto legislation, so they could they could veto senatorial decrees, so they could veto what the consuls did, right? So there was an extremely checked system. And so then in emergencies, that is namely when Rome was going to be invaded or when there was a rebellion, there was an emergency power which permitted a circumvention of the veto system, which meant you name somebody else to exercise executive power for 6 months, up to 6 months. And for 300 years, that's what worked. So that there would be a dictator appointed when there was an emergency. He would exercise power and solve the emergency, and then he would step down. And he always stepped down. This happened from 500 BC to 300. Yeah, he always stepped down. But the point is, this was a band of equal people, more or less. These were all, and the guy who was appointed dictator had been consul before. The consuls would typically become consuls around a little after they're 40 years old. These are the chief executives. They would rotate into the Senate. They'd sit there for another 30, 40 years. And so a dictator, when he was appointed, typically was 65 or 70. That was a typical thing. You appoint him, he doesn't have a long necessarily, he doesn't foresee taking over for a long time. So he just resolves the issue. And he can't be vetoed. He can execute somebody on the spot. That's a big thing. So, it's usually something violent, so you need violence. But the point is, so that worked pretty well, right? And so it was decisive when it had to be, and it wasn't decisive when it didn't have to be. The rotation was very systematic, which meant, you weren't supposed to run for re-election, and nobody did for 300 years, right? So it was a rotation. The Senate was deliberating every day, about policy, and the consuls more or less did. They followed the suggestions of the Senate. So it ran as a very effective, fairly broad-based oligarchy where there was rotation in office and where the policies were relatively effective and where militarily they were extremely effective. So that's the period in which Rome, went from a little teeny city to an empire. And once it got pretty big, then it began to fall apart, in different ways. All right, so yeah.
Just I have a question more about the methodology of this discussion. I've not read the book, but like the fact of using these examples as models and taking them in vacuum. Like typically, the Weimar Republic is taken as an example of a failed republic for the outcome. But you have to see it in the condition in which it was operating. So, in some sense, it seems hard to use these examples and say, okay, they had this kind of relationship between the president, which was very strong actually at the time of Weimar, compared to And then taking them impact on, we don't know how, say, the Mediterranean US system would have worked in those conditions, which were pretty harsh.
Agreed.
So I don't know what's your thought about that, and I don't know how they are using these examples, but like in some sense, using these examples and this comparative history as like models to argue about abstract concepts is a little dangerous sometimes.
Yeah, the trouble is that's what's happening. You know, whether we do it or not, that is what happens. Okay, so let me say about Weimar. I think Weimar worked well for a long time. I mean, not 5 years. So it worked well during the hyperinflation, you know, because the president had emergency power, modeled on Rome, incidentally. The Article 48 in the Weimar Constitution was modeled on the Roman dictator. The only difference was that the Roman dictator was not an executive. He was pulled out of the Senate, right? Whereas Weimar, the president himself had the emergency power, which turned out to be very dangerous at the very end, you know, because then, you know, Hindenburg appointed Hitler. That was not a good idea. But up to then, you know, he used the emergency power to manage the fact that the legislature could not enact a budget. They could not form a new currency, which he did in 23 and 24. So it was very successful then. And then for the next 5 years, it was very successful until the Great Depression. When that hit, it destroyed Germany, basically. And I think everything else was not really determined by Weimar. It was determined by the Depression and by crazy policies. You know, so they went into this hugely austerity policy at exactly the wrong time. So, you know, I don't blame that on the institution. That's really, like you said, harsh conditions. But the trouble is that harsh conditions are where these things are redesigned. So the reason Eric and Adrian write this book now is because they regard the post 9/11 and the post 2008 presidentially led policies as successful and as a way to redesign American institutions in the direction of presidential plebiscitarianism, right? So that's what they're pushing, and the people who are also pushing it are relatively powerful. I mean, the lawyers working for Obama, a lot of them think this is a good idea. So it's a bipartisan idiocy.
Any president.
Yeah. Right.
This is a good idea.
Yeah. So the reason to talk about it is not that this is the right way the best way to talk about it, but it's an issue that is kind of pre-theoretical. It's a thing that I wanted to put on the table where people can talk about it. And if you can figure out a way to make some progress in modeling it analytically, I think that's fantastic.
I think there is an interesting point to make in some sense, and it's exactly what you said. There is a bit of a problem of time inconsistency in the way the systems evolve, because whoever is in power wants to push the system to its limits. And then once they are not in power, they don't want that anymore. But the president remains. And then when the Bush administration pushes the line, then the Democrat.
Yeah, back here. Yes.
So from the discussion we're having, it looks like we're judging different republics by how stable they were, like how much time it took them to switch to an autocracy. Whereas I think the question is whether how good they are at solving the problems that fall onto them. So basically probably these are different things, stability versus performance.
Yeah, I guess I think that they're related in some way.
Yeah.
Do you think they're not?
They're related, but they're different.
Yeah.
So those who substituted for, like, aren't beginning to study stability per se, rather than performance.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at the level I'm talking about it now, I mean, I guess in the case of Weimar, I think that it fell apart and was unstable was performance didn't work. The performance thing was so bad, not for reasons necessarily attributable to the institutions, but it was a bad luck situation for Weimar, I think. So, I guess. So I think for purposes of the discussion, they're closely enough related that well, I don't know. I think they're related. That's what I'm saying. I can't pull them apart right now enough. Well, I'll think about it. Okay, Jim.
So I'm wondering why you don't, in terms of Latin American cases, where there's just time after time after time of a president exploiting their executive emergency powers and then changing things wholeheartedly and keeping in power, and then you end up with authoritarianism and so on. It seems that anybody who's going to attack the notion that a strong presidency who's going to have almost emergency-like powers is a bad idea would say, well, just look at the basket cases of Latin
Yeah, but there's some that aren't basket cases. I mean, you look at Colombia. Colombia has a very strong president who substantially has often ruled through decree and has often been relatively successful sometimes. I mean, Uribe was a pretty successful president in many ways, even though he was pretty authoritarian, and he ruled through decree. Now, there's been a lot of pushback in Colombia, but I mean, the point, I'm not completely against executive power. The reason Uribe ruled as an authoritarian fashion is he has a revolution in front of him. Like he had the FARC, all these people, and the paramilitaries, and all these people running around killing each other. So that was what, anyway. So, and now sometimes, ruling through decree can degenerate into an autocracy which is independent of the circumstances, as happens, happened in Argentina, it happened in Chile, but it's, so what do you want me to say from it?
What I'm imagining is, what I hear you saying is the idea of pulling in an outsider during the emergency who doesn't have a stake in staying there and changing the whole constitution to stay in power now for the next 40 years or something is a good idea. If you were going to go in the direction of expanding the
that's what the Romans did. That's what the Romans did. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, it sounds like you're
I haven't quite
liking that. And I would guess that a good way to say yes, and even more evidence that allowing the president to have emergency powers and stay in after is to look at a lot of Latin American cases as cases where it didn't work out so well. Some maybe worked out okay, but I think on average, people would say it didn't.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different alternatives. I mean, one problem with a president ruling through decree in the American system or the Latin American system is the president has a term independently of the level of support he enjoys in the country. Now, in Latin America, it tends to be a one-term limit, but not always. The United States is two-term limits, but still a term. So you can lose political support and still rule through decree, and that pretty regularly happens in the United States. I mean, you follow an adverse midterm election, a president can't get anything through Congress. What does he do? He rules essentially through decree, through executive order, through other things he can do. So that's a problem. Now, there's several different kinds of solutions. One would be to stop being a presidential system, to go in, a more European direction where you have a parliamentary system where you actually have to maintain support, or you have to resign or have another election. And that's a different system in which the same incentive to run through decrees may not be as strong. So that's another alternative. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that the only way to do it is the Roman way of appointing a dictator who's from outside the system. That could be one way, but there could be other ways. Yeah, back there. Whose hand is up?
David? I just want to go back to Tom from Roman's observation bit. So I'm listening to a lot of anecdotes and sort of analogies and examples. But what do you mean, or do you have any idea what you understand by the notion of balance? I mean, it seems to be that it's all very context specific. That's sort of part of the challenge, right? In times of war, what we think about as a balanced system is rather different than in times of peace. And so if we're trying to design a system and find the right place and nature of checks on the different systems, branches we may or may not have in the government.
I agree.
I don't know quite what we're trying to strive. This is the output aspect.
So I agree. Balance is context specific. I agree with that. So in wartime, if you're being invaded, then you're going to give up on deliberation a little bit, and you're going to give up on assent a little bit, and you're going to try to solve the problem of the organization of force and deal with the issue. That's for sure. So the appropriate balance is going to depend on the issue. I agree with that. So, 2008, financial markets are collapsing, people are panicking. Yeah, but the point is, when that happens, that the balance ought to shift as the problem shifts, so that insofar as you resolve the issue, there ought to be a restoration of the virtues of the other elements. That is to say, not energy isn't everything. At some point, you want to have some capacity to deliberate. That is, in particular, to allow criticism, to seriously have the capacity to revise policy, and that's very difficult for a hierarchical institution. So you can say, okay, in the American system or any presidential system, a president may have to have some power in emergency that's very strong, but there has to be some way for it to ratchet back when the emergency, attenuates to some extent. You see what I'm saying? So I agree with you. Balance is not a fixed place. That's right.
I mean, I guess, I'm not going to dispute. Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that's.
Yeah.
But the challenge analytically then is how do we define the incentive structure where it seems to be what we're seeking in every sort of time or context is an appropriate notion of balance for that time and how to get now ex post.
Right.
Is it going back to what we had before? But that's almost surely not right. I mean,
Yeah, I agree with that.
and so the very sort of, I mean, in clear terms, what are the preferences against which we're trying to align incentives
Yeah.
are themselves mutual in the nature of the scenarios we're considering here.
Yeah.
From a social point of view, I don't know.
Okay, so presidential systems tend to have an institution to solve this, which are emergency powers. The American system doesn't actually have technical emergency powers, but presidents have kind of invented it. So under the rubric of commander-in-chief powers or the non-suspension of habeas corpus, they kind of glued together a capacity to act in extremis that is not built into the Constitution in any sort of literal sense. But, Weimar had Article 48. The French Fifth Republic Constitution has Article 16, which is emergency. I mean, this is very common in presidential systems. Parliamentary systems don't seem to have that as much, right? They seem to, be able to adjust more. I don't know exactly how it's done, but in a different way. So one way to do this is to say when you're in a sufficiently unusual situation, you resort to another institution, and then otherwise you spring back to the ex-ante institutions. Now, you're right, that's probably not optimal. You wouldn't necessarily want to spring back. I mean, look at post 9/11 circumstances in which there's some sense in which people might want to attack the United States by using airplanes or whatever. So you need something different than the balance that was there before, probably. That's true. So I agree. And I agree with that. So, yeah.
Yeah, how would you relate this debate to the recent experience of technocratic governments in Southern Europe? So, where, the institutions do not change, but, somebody like a central banker or an economist is going to be from the outside.
Yeah, well, I think that these technical governments, like in Italy or maybe to some extent in Greece before the election, are examples of emergency rule. That's pretty much like the Weimar Article 48 in the first phase of Weimar, 1920s. So early 20s, where, so that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to think in certain policy areas. You need a different policy structure. So you have independent central banks that exist alongside and permanently against other institutions and insulated from other institutions. So that's to say that certain kinds of policies are prone to, the need for decisive action and maybe secret action, like, monetary decisions. So that's another design issue.
But why do you call those emergency rules? Like the parliament elects a government, the parliament is still in charge in some sense, and so nothing has changed within, say, what happened in Italy. I think the real risk is what was discussed for the example of Greece, where, say, Germany was suggesting skip the election. I mean, something like that would have been a change in the institution in some way implicitly. But what happened in Italy, it's just a government. I mean, it's within the system completely.
I agree. Yeah. I agree. I mean, for some reason there seems to be a convention about technical governments that happens. It's not just here, but sometimes it happens during wartime. So like a wartime cabinet in a parliamentary system often is a kind of technical government, where it's often bipartisan or blah, blah. So that's, and that's, I don't know how to explain it. It's not just.
I guess there's a sense in which you have a change in the habits, because the habits is that the parties, which are part of the system, though not written in the Constitution, they play a certain role, and what happens is that they stop playing that role in that sense. In some sense, the material Constitution has changed, but the system is the same.
Yeah. No, I agree. From a certain level of description, it's the same, but there's been some convention, either in terms of competition or in terms of accepting a certain makeup of a cabinet that would not ordinarily be accepted. So, no, I agree. And I don't. Okay, I agree with that. I guess my worry is that the people who are pushing presidentialism and presidential plebiscitarianism are thinking of something that is actually transformative of the way the institutions work. And I think there's enough reason to think that there's been a steady transformation in the United States towards presidential power that it's a worry. And so, what we're trying to do is come up with something of either a framework for discussing and also a set of reforms that could, in principle, check this.
So Just a question, just a curiosity, I don't even know. Can one make the case that in some sense a stronger presidential system, more presidentialism, may be associated even with weaker executive government, in the sense that you sometimes have the president that is not necessarily the prime minister, and so you can have a weak executive, like Weimar was an example of that, where the president in some sense will sidestepping the government.
Right,
so in some sense you can have both things. You can have a very strong president and a very weak executive, and that's the worst.
That's like the French Fifth Republic sometimes works that way. So, yeah, my understanding of the way that works, though, is that when there's no cohabitation, when they're both in the same hands, you have that. You have a strong president and a weak executive. But when you have cohabitation, you basically have a strong president and a strong prime minister, and typically in conflict, which may be good, but it's a different structure. So I wanted to say most of what we've talked about are checks and balances, which are legislative ideas, mostly, at least the way I've discussed them. And another aspect of their book has to do with the role of law in constraining a president or executive. And there's a very good book that just was published by a guy named Jack Goldsmith, who's a colleague, he's a colleague of Adrian's at Harvard, and he was the one who went into the Office of Legal Counsel to sort of help rescind the John Yoo memos. But he's ideologically very close to these people. But he has a very different view of the relative role of law inside the executive branch than do Adrian and Eric, and I think it's really interesting, which is Eric and Adrian think that law cannot, in principle, cabin a president. And they associate themselves with arguments that Carl Schmitt made under Weimar, that basically law just, the executive is so creative as a force, and he's so much identified with the popular majority that it's impossible for legal constraints to actually be effective. But Goldsmith basically looks in detail at what happened after 9/11 and shows that at least this is only an example, but that in effect the laws that were enacted by Congress for over several years that are aimed at controlling the president actually had the effect inside the presidency not of, well, first of all, hiring lots of lawyers inside the executive branch, but the lawyers were employed not so much to figure out how to sidestep the law, but to build policy processes which basically implemented the law in extremely literal ways. And so I think it's actually an open question how much law can constrain an executive, at least in the context of the American presidency. Because it's not so clear. So, for example, Goldsmith argues that the effect of laws having to do with torture in the United States has been to essentially sanitize torture, so that it makes it more useful as executive. That is not, they don't do waterboarding, like particular techniques are out, but the chain of approvals and legal approvals that happen before using a specific interrogation technique are very difficult to challenge, so that in effect a president can use them more effectively. And similarly with targeting, like the Obama policy of targeting people overseas with predator weapons, that too, the claim is that by building in legal constraints on what it takes to sign off on a target, you have many lawyers who are in line positions who have to sign through, before you target somebody. It makes it much more usable to a president and used more frequently, which is what we see under Obama. That is, there's much more use of, targeting on all kinds of people, and it's clearly the new policy. That is, as the Americans withdraw from Afghanistan and Iraq, we're going to be using a lot of these remote instruments, so it's time.
Yes, so a lot of what you've talked about is the weakness of the legislature and the statutes that they pass relative to the executive. But where do the courts come in? I mean, it seems like the courts have a capability. Yeah. They sort of passed on a lot of it.
Well,
they've had the opportunity to place a lot of restrictions or nullify some of these laws if they're viewed as.
I'm actually pretty sanguine about the courts relative to Congress, because the courts did step in on a number, on some of the Guantanamo cases, and they're still there, and there's a very active Guantanamo bar, and the courts are not closing the doors to these people. So there's all kinds of things going on the judicial side. But our argument about one-way ratchet is it privileges both the judiciary and the president. So I think courts do this. I mean, it's true. So I think courts are, and that's why I agree with Goldsmith that there's legal constraints coming from courts can be pretty effective on a president. Partially because presidents have some kind of an interest in complying with them rather than straight out defying them. So, So that's, I mean, we haven't written as much in this version about courts, but anyway, so our basic wonder is what to do about, which I mentioned but we haven't gone into, which is the collective action issues that get in the way of congressional checks. That is to say that individual congressmen, have different incentives than maintaining the power of Congress as such. And this is dramatized when a different party controls the president as controls the Congress, so that Republicans didn't complain when Bush was taking more power for the president, and Democrats don't when Obama is bombing people long distance, right? So this is a long-term thing, but it's even more dramatic than that because individual congressmen have lots of incentives to impose checks on individual agencies to extract advantages for their constituents or for. So there's this mismatch of incentives at the level of Congress, and the question is, can that be corrected? So we thought of some ideas, but they're in the paper, but they're pretty weak. Like, like somehow, managing delegations. So there's a delegated authority. If you believe the Oneway Ratchet story or something, some version of it, which can be modeled, then you might figure out something to do about managing delegations in a way that either makes them revert to Congress or permits certain kinds of control. So one thing I've written a paper about is, it used to be the case before 1983 that Congress could delegate authority to an agency and retain veto power over the regulations it issued. This is called legislative veto. And that's been made illegal in a famous decision of the Supreme Court. Probably a bad idea in my view. That's why my paper was about that. Because it basically, was a way for Congress to give sort of, a regulated delegation rather than a full-blown delegation. Similarly, the Supreme Court has ruled that when there's a congressional statute delegating authority to an agency, and the court will defer to the agency's interpretation of what that statute means, if it's at all compatible with the law, with the language, right? So even if that's called the Chevron doctrine. So that doctrine permits. So you have a change of, the change of government from a Democrat to a Republican. New agency heads come in across the board. Their interpretation of what any given statute means tend to be this far apart, and the courts defer to the new interpretation, which basically allows, again, the executive, the hierarchical aspect of the executive, the presidential appointees, to control the interpretation of what Congress did in enacting the legislation. So again, it emasculates the congressional hold on the nature of its delegation. So those are things that could be, ameliorated to some extent. Back.
I guess the empirical thing that this collective action problem really is getting in the way. Like, we have plenty of examples, I feel like, in recent times of Congress and committee chairs in particular taking a fairly activist oversight role of the executive branch, right? Appointing special prosecutors, holding very confrontational hearings. Like, not on, so it's true, not on like the failure of a declaration of war for Iraq, but on things. And it's just not clear to me whether what's going on here is actually an institutional failure or a particular set of policies on which the president has acted in a way that seems expansionist, and Congress hasn't taken stance opposed to Congress quite generally suffering from a collective action problem that prevented it from challenging the executive.
Yeah, to my knowledge, the special prosecutors that have been appointed have been in circumstances of divided government. So it's, essentially, Democrats investigating a Republican, or the other way around. So that's an example of a collective action problem. That is, so you don't get Republicans appointing special prosecutors to go after Bush, or you don't get Democrats appointing special prosecutors to go after Obama.
Why aren't elections the answer, right? So that is, if the executive is really overstepping and the voters are really
they're a good answer if we're a parliamentary system, because the trouble now is, you get a midterm election and you got 2 years of president ruling to decree, and so the trouble is, the nice thing about it, well, members of the president's party do not hold hearings. You don't get oversized hearings, that doesn't happen. Investigatory hearings do not happen in a unified government. They just don't happen. So, as soon as one chamber is controlled by the other party, then you get plenty of hearings. But it's just that it doesn't happen when powers are divided. So that's what my worry is. Now, if you could have elections right away, as they do in parliamentary systems, if government collapses, you go to the polls. That's something else. But what we have now is a period, you know, a sort of relatively long periods in which presidents are just not controlled.
It's only 2 years.
It could be 4, could be 2 or 4. Yeah.
But only if the voters want it to be 4.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's enough. I don't know. I'm skeptical that that's enough, but maybe. So we have another one, which is congressional impact statements. Or constitutional impact statements. So when there's a delegation, there could be like an assessment of the structure of it. You know, I'm about done anyway. So that's another, but it's kind of a weak idea. But it's like an idea where you might have some kind of publicity of what's happening. So that would be an idea of kind of shaming individual congressmen into lining up their incentives to pay some attention to the interests of the chamber itself. So in Madison's defense of the checks and balances system in Federalist 51, he talked about aligning the interests of the man, which being the congressman or the politician, with the interests of the place. And so the argument was that the system that he outlined or that he defended in 51, that is the constitutional system as designed in the Constitution, had the circumstance that it lined up the incentives of the individual members of each branch with the interests of their institutions. And as we said, we think it works reasonably well for the president and reasonably well for the judiciary and just not that well for Congress. It's not to say that it doesn't work at all. It's just that it doesn't work that well for Congress, and it hasn't worked that well for Congress from the beginning. So there's been a long-term transformation of the American system from a system of what we think is relative, you know, balanced to some extent, to a less balanced system. And that may be a good or necessary thing, but maybe not. So that's the line of what we're pushing. So I'm finished.
Thank you.
Thank you.